The Lamia, ancient child-stealing demons. What if I told you that every nightmare you've ever had about something watching you sleep wasn't just your imagination? What if those ancient warnings your grandmother whispered about monsters in the dark were based on something real? Something that has been hunting humanity for over 3,000 years? Tonight, we're diving deep into one of the most terrifying creatures ever conceived by the human mind. A demon so horrifying that mothers across the ancient world would tremble at the mere mention of her name. A seductress so deadly that men would rather die than fall under her spell. This is the story of the Lamia, and I promise you, by the end of this video, you'll never look at the shadows in your bedroom the same way again. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. The Lamia wasn't just a monster. She was once human, once a mother, once a woman so beautiful that she caught the eye of a god. And what happened to her? What transformed her into the child-murdering demon that parents feared for millennia is a tragedy so profound that it will shake you to your core. Stay with me, because what you're about to discover connects ancient mythology to modern psychology in ways that scientists are only now beginning to understand. And the most chilling part? The Lamia's influence never really died. She's still here, hiding in plain sight, woven into our culture, our fears, our very DNA. Let me take you back to where it all began, to a time when gods walked among mortals and jealousy could curse you for eternity. Picture ancient Greece over 3,000 years ago. The Mediterranean sun beats down on marble temples. The scent of olive groves fills the air. And in the kingdom of Libya, there lives a woman whose beauty is so extraordinary that it transcends mortal comprehension. Her name is Lamia, and she is a queen, daughter of Poseidon himself, god of the seas. Her skin glows like polished bronze. Her eyes hold the depth of the ocean. Her voice is said to make grown men weep with its sweetness. But beauty, especially divine beauty, is a dangerous thing in the world of Greek mythology. Because up on Mount Olympus, someone is always watching. And the king of the gods, Zeus, has noticed Lamia. Of course, he has. Zeus, whose appetite for mortal women is as legendary as his thunderbolts, becomes obsessed with her. He descends from his celestial throne, takes on a mortal form, and seduces the Libyan queen. Now, you might think this is where Lamia's story becomes one of fortune and blessing. After all, being chosen by the king of the gods should be an honor, right? Wrong. Because there's someone else watching too. Someone whose jealousy burns hotter than the sun itself. Hera, queen of the gods, Zeus's wife, and the most vengeful deity in the entire Greek pantheon. Hera has watched her husband betray her countless times. She's seen him chase nymphs, seduce mortals, and transform into animals to trick unsuspecting women. But something about Lamia drives Hera to a level of rage that surpasses all her previous fury. Maybe it's because Lamia is so beautiful. Maybe it's because Zeus seems genuinely infatuated rather than just lustful. Or maybe it's simply because Hera has finally had enough. But here's what makes this story so devastating. Hera doesn't punish Zeus. Gods rarely punish other gods, especially when those gods are more powerful. Instead, she does what vengeful deities always do. She punishes the mortal woman. She punishes Lamia. And the punishment she chooses is so cruel, so utterly monstrous, that it would change the very nature of what Lamia was. Hera discovers that Lamia has given birth to Zeus's children. Beautiful, innocent children. And in a single night of divine wrath, Hera murders every single one of them. She rips them from Lamia's arms and destroys them, one by one, as Lamia screams in anguish. Imagine it for just a moment. Put yourself in Lamia's position. You're a mother, and in one terrible night, every child you've ever loved is taken from you. Not by disease, not by accident, but by deliberate, calculated murder. And there's nothing you can do to stop it. Nothing you can do to protect them. You're powerless against the will of a goddess. The grief that overwhelms Lamia is beyond human comprehension. It's the kind of loss that shatters the soul, that breaks something fundamental in the architecture of who you are. She weeps until her tears run dry. She screams until her voice becomes a rasp. And then something inside her breaks completely. The woman she was dies in that moment, and something else is born. Something dark, something monstrous, something that the ancient world would fear for thousands of years. This is the origin of the Lamia as a demon, as a monster, as a creature of pure vengeance and grief. And here's what the ancient Greeks understood about trauma that we're only now rediscovering. When you experience loss so profound that it destroys your identity, you don't just grieve. You transform. You become something else entirely. Lamia's transformation isn't instantaneous in some versions of the myth. It's gradual, agonizing, like watching someone drown in slow motion. Her beautiful eyes become wild, predatory. Her lovely voice turns into a hiss. Her graceful movements become serpentine. In many tellings, her lower body literally transforms into that of a serpent, a massive snake that coils and strikes. She becomes a hybrid creature, half woman, half snake, all rage and sorrow. But the most horrific part of her transformation isn't physical. It's psychological. Because Lamia, in her grief-maddened state, makes a terrible decision. She decides that if she cannot have her children, then no mother will. If her arms are empty, then all arms will be empty. She becomes a child killer herself, stalking the night, hunting for infants to murder in their cribs. Think about the twisted logic of trauma here. Lamia isn't killing children because she hates them. She's killing them because she loved her own so much that she cannot bear to see other mothers have what was stolen from her. It's grief turned inside out, love transformed into its dark mirror image. And this is why the Lamia myth resonated so powerfully across ancient cultures, because it speaks to a primal fear that every parent has ever felt. Now, in some versions of the myth, Hera's cruelty doesn't end with the murder of Lamia's children. Oh no, the goddess adds one more curse, one more layer of torture to Lamia's eternal suffering. Hera takes away Lamia's ability to close her eyes. She forces Lamia to remain forever awake, forever conscious, unable to find even the temporary escape of sleep, unable to stop seeing the faces of her murdered children in every waking moment. Zeus, who caused all of this suffering in the first place, takes pity on Lamia. But his pity is weak, insufficient. He cannot undo Hera's curse. He cannot restore Lamia's children to life. He cannot give back what was stolen. Instead, he grants Lamia one small mercy. He gives her the ability to remove her eyes, to take them out of her head and place them in a jar, so that she might have some respite from her torment. It's a grotesque gift, simultaneously compassionate and horrifying. Can you imagine the symbolism there? Lamia must literally blind herself to find any peace. She must physically remove her ability to see the world, to see the children she can never have again, to see the joy of other mothers that will forever be denied to her. It's a perfect metaphor for how trauma forces us to disconnect from reality, to remove ourselves from normal human experience just to survive. And so Lamia begins her eternal hunt. She slithers through the darkness of ancient Greece, searching for the homes of new mothers, for the cribs of sleeping infants. She is drawn to them like a moth to flame, compelled by a grief so profound it has become its own kind of hunger. In the dead of night, when the household is silent and still, Lamia creeps through windows and cracks in doors. Her serpentine body makes no sound as it winds through the shadows. The ancient Greeks called her a child-eating demon, but that's not quite accurate. Lamia doesn't eat children for sustenance. She kills them to spread her suffering, to make the world as broken as she feels inside. In some accounts, she drinks their blood. In others, she simply steals their life force, their breath, leaving behind tiny corpses that appear to have died of natural causes. Sudden infant death, the ancients called it, never knowing that they were describing what we now call SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome, but attributing it to the vengeful spirit of a grieving mother. This is where the Lamia myth becomes truly fascinating from a historical and anthropological perspective, because every culture, in every part of the world, has a version of this creature. A demon that kills babies, a spirit that stalks mothers and children. The specifics change, the names change, but the core fear remains the same. In Jewish folklore, there's Lilith. In Arabic tradition, there's the ghoul. In Slavic mythology, there's the Mora. In Polynesian legend, there's the Pelesit. All of them, fundamentally, are Lamia under different names. Why? Why does this particular nightmare appear across every human culture? The answer is both simple and heartbreaking. Because infant mortality was, for most of human history, devastatingly common. Before modern medicine, before we understood disease, hygiene, and nutrition, babies died all the time. And parents, desperate to make sense of this senseless tragedy, needed something to blame. They needed a reason, a cause, even if that cause was a monster. Because a monster, at least, could be fought. A monster could be warded off with prayers, charms, and rituals. Random chance? Random chance offers no such comfort. So Lamia became real to the ancient Greeks in a way that's hard for us to understand today. She wasn't just a story. She was an ever-present threat, a genuine danger that required constant vigilance. Mothers would hang charms over their babies' cribs. They would mark their doorways with protective symbols. They would pray to guardian deities, begging for protection from the child-stealing demon. And here's something that will send chills down your spine. Many of these protective rituals, they still exist today. That lullaby you sing to your baby, that's a warding charm. That mobile you hang over the crib, that's a protective amulet. That night light you leave on in the nursery, that's to keep the demons of darkness at bay. We've forgotten the original purpose, but the rituals remain, passed down through countless generations, from mothers who genuinely believed that something evil might come for their children in the night. But Lamia's mythology doesn't end with child murder. Oh no, because there's a second aspect to her legend that's equally terrifying and psychologically complex. Lamia doesn't just kill children. She also seduces men. And this duality, this combination of maternal grief and sexual predation, is what makes her one of the most psychologically sophisticated monsters in all of mythology. Let me explain how this works in the ancient sources. After Lamia has transformed into a demon, after she has become a creature of night and shadow, she discovers that she still possesses her original beauty. She can still appear as the stunning queen she once was. And she uses this beauty as a weapon, as a trap, as a tool of destruction. The stories tell of Lamia appearing to men in their sleep, or in lonely places, taking the form of a beautiful woman. She seduces them with her voice, her eyes, her promises of pleasure. The men, enchanted by her beauty, fall under her spell completely. They follow her into the darkness. They give themselves over to her completely. And then, when they are at their most vulnerable, when they are lost in ecstasy or sleep, Lamia reveals her true form. The beautiful woman becomes the serpent demon, and she feeds on them, draining their life force, leaving them dead or mad or forever changed. This aspect of the Lamia myth connects her to a whole category of creatures called the Empusa, or the Lamiae in plural, female demons who seduce and destroy men. In some traditions, Lamia becomes the mother or queen of all such creatures, spawning an entire race of seductive demons. They are sometimes described as having one leg made of brass or bronze, sometimes as having the ability to shapeshift at will, sometimes as being vampiric in nature, feeding on human blood. Now, you might be wondering, why would a creature driven by grief over her murdered children also be a sexual predator who kills men? What's the connection? And this is where ancient Greek psychology becomes absolutely fascinating. Because the Greeks understood something about trauma and sexuality that modern psychology has only recently rediscovered. When someone experiences profound trauma, especially trauma related to their body or their relationships, their sexuality often becomes distorted, weaponized, or used as a tool of control or revenge. Lamia was violated by Zeus. Her consent in their relationship is, at best, questionable, given the massive power imbalance between a god and a mortal. She was then punished for that violation by having her children murdered. Her body, her sexuality, her maternal love, all of it was used against her, twisted into a source of suffering. So she, in turn, uses sexuality as a weapon. She turns her beauty, which once attracted a god and brought about her destruction, into a lure for destruction. She takes control of her sexuality by making it deadly. She reclaims her power by making men suffer as she has suffered. It's a deeply disturbing psychological portrait, but it's also remarkably sophisticated for a myth that's over 3,000 years old. The ancient Greeks understood that trauma doesn't just affect you emotionally. It affects how you relate to others, how you use your body, how you express or suppress your desires. Lamia's dual nature as child killer and seductress isn't a contradiction. It's two sides of the same coin, two expressions of the same fundamental brokenness. And the men who fall victim to Lamia, they represent something, too. In many versions of the story, the men she seduces are often young, often arrogant, often men who think themselves immune to danger or deception. They see a beautiful woman and assume she exists for their pleasure. They never consider that she might have her own agenda, her own pain, her own capacity for violence. Lamia punishes that assumption. She shows them that women, even beautiful women, especially beautiful women who have been hurt, are not safe objects of desire. They can be dangerous. They can kill. There's a famous story about Lamia from the philosopher Philostratus, written in the 2nd century CE, that illustrates this perfectly. A young philosopher named Menippus encounters a beautiful woman on the road. She's elegant, wealthy, sophisticated. She invites him to her luxurious home. They become lovers. Menippus is completely enchanted, ready to marry her. But then his teacher, the wise philosopher Apollonius, arrives and immediately sees through the illusion. He recognizes that the woman is actually a Lamia in disguise. He confronts her in front of Menippus and all their guests. At first, the Lamia tries to deny it, tries to maintain her beautiful human appearance. But Apollonius is persistent. He calls out her true nature, and slowly, the illusion begins to crumble. The luxurious house fades away, revealed to be an empty ruin. The fine food and wine disappear, and the beautiful woman transforms, her features shifting, her body contorting, until the serpent demon is revealed. The Lamia admits that she was planning to devour Menippus, to feed on his youth and vitality. She was fattening him up, so to speak, with luxury and pleasure, before consuming him entirely. This story became hugely influential in Western literature. John Keats wrote a famous poem about it in 1819 called Lamia, which reimagines the tale as a tragic love story. In Keats' version, the Lamia genuinely loves Menippus, and when her true nature is revealed, she doesn't want to hurt him. She simply vanishes, destroyed by the harsh light of rational inquiry. It's a fascinating romantic reinterpretation that makes the Lamia sympathetic, a victim of circumstance rather than a malicious predator. But I want to pull back from the romantic reimagining and return to the original horror, because there's something crucial we need to understand about how the ancient Greeks actually viewed Lamia and her kind. These weren't just campfire stories. These weren't just myths to entertain people. Lamia was a real presence in the ancient world, a genuine belief that shaped behavior and culture. There are ancient Greek magical papyri, actual documents preserved from antiquity, that contain spells and rituals specifically designed to protect against Lamia and similar demons. These aren't theoretical texts. These are practical manuals used by actual people who believe they were in real danger. The spells are detailed and specific. They tell you what herbs to burn, what words to speak, what symbols to draw on your doorway to keep the child-stealing demons away. One spell instructs mothers to hang a piece of iron above their infant's bed because demons were believed to fear iron. Another tells you to keep a light burning all night because Lamia prefers darkness. Another recommends sleeping with your child between you and your husband so that two adult souls surround and protect the vulnerable infant soul. These aren't superstitions in the sense of baseless fears. These are logical responses to a genuine belief in supernatural danger. And here's where it gets really interesting. These protection rituals actually worked. Not because they magically repelled demons, but because they represented attentive parenting. Keeping a light burning meant you could check on your child regularly. Sleeping close to your infant meant you would notice if they stopped breathing. Hanging charms and performing rituals meant you were thinking about your child's safety constantly, maintaining vigilance. The magic was real, just not in the way the ancients thought. This is the power of the Lamia myth. It transformed abstract anxiety into concrete action. It gave parents something to do in the face of the terrifying randomness of infant mortality. And in doing so, it probably saved lives, even if the mechanism was entirely psychological rather than supernatural. But let's talk about what Lamia actually looked like in the ancient imagination, because the descriptions vary widely depending on the source and the time period. In the earliest mentions, Lamia is barely described at all. She's more of a concept than a creature, a name for a type of demon rather than a specific individual. But as the myth develops and spreads, the descriptions become more detailed, more horrifying. In some accounts, Lamia retains her human upper body, but her lower half is entirely serpentine, like a massive python or sea serpent. Her scales are said to shimmer with an oily iridescence. Her tail is powerful enough to crush a man's chest. She moves with unnatural speed, striking like a viper when she attacks. Her hands have become claws, sharp enough to tear flesh. Her teeth are fangs, designed for ripping and tearing. But it's her eyes that are always emphasized as her most disturbing feature. Even when she can remove them, even when she places them in that jar Zeus gave her, her eye sockets remain. And when she puts her eyes back into hunt, they glow with an unnatural light. Some sources say they burn like fire. Others say they're cold as ice, pale and dead-looking. Still others describe them as hypnotic, capable of freezing victims in place with a single glance. In other versions, Lamia can transform completely between human and monster form. She appears as a beautiful woman, often young and seemingly innocent. She might pose as a widow, or a lost traveler, or a seductress. Only when she has her victim alone, vulnerable, does she reveal her true nature. The transformation is described as horrifying to witness. Bones crack and reshape. Skin splits and reforms. The beautiful face distorts into something reptilian. It's described as traumatic enough to drive men mad. Seeing something so beautiful become so monstrous in seconds. And then there are the versions that make Lamia even more alien, more incomprehensible. Some sources describe her as having multiple forms, shifting constantly, never quite settling on a single appearance. She might have the head of a lion, the body of a goat, and the tail of a serpent. Or she might be headless, her face on her torso. Or she might be covered in eyes, hundreds of them, all watching, all seeing. These more fantastical descriptions likely represent different local traditions merging together, different communities adding their own cultural fears to the basic Lamia template. What's consistent across all descriptions is that Lamia is liminal. She exists between categories. She's neither fully human nor fully animal. She's neither alive nor dead. She's neither beautiful nor hideous, but somehow both at once. This liminality is crucial to understanding her power as a mythological figure. She represents boundary crossing, the violation of natural categories. And humans, across all cultures, are deeply disturbed by things that don't fit neatly into our mental boxes. There's a concept in Japanese aesthetics called the uncanny valley, popularized in robotics and computer animation. It describes the sense of revulsion we feel when something looks almost human but not quite. That subtle wrongness triggers deep unease. Lamia lives in that valley. She's close enough to human that we recognize her, but different enough that our instincts scream danger. Now, as Greek civilization evolved and changed, so too did the Lamia myth. In the classical period, during the height of Athens' power, Lamia stories became more literary, more philosophical. Playwrights and poets used Lamia as a metaphor for various social anxieties. She represented the danger of female sexuality unconstrained by marriage and motherhood. She represented the foreigner, the exotic threat from Libya and other non-Greek lands. She represented the irrational, the emotional, everything that Greek philosophy tried to control through reason and logic. The playwright Aristophanes mentions Lamia in several of his comedies, using her as a punchline, a byword for something scary that everyone knows about. It's like saying the bogeyman, today a shorthand for childhood fears. This tells us that by the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, Lamia had become so embedded in Greek culture that you could reference her casually and everyone would understand. But Lamia also appears in much darker contexts. The historian Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BCE, gives us one of the most detailed accounts of Lamia's origin. He presents her not as a victim of Hera's jealousy, but as a powerful queen who went mad with grief and began eating children. In his version, Lamia's subjects eventually rose up against her, terrified by her cannibalistic rampage. They drove her out of Libya, into the wilderness, where she became even more monstrous, breeding with demons and spawning an entire race of child-eating creatures. This version strips away the sympathy of the earlier tale. There's no mention of Zeus or Hera. Lamia is simply a mother who responds to the loss of her children by becoming a monster voluntarily. It's a harder, more judgmental version of the myth, one that seems to blame Lamia for her own transformation. And this shift tells us something about how attitudes toward women were changing in the later Greek world. The patriarchal structures were hardening, becoming more rigid. Women's pain was less likely to be seen as a justification for anything. Even monstrous behavior born from unbearable grief was now just monstrous behavior. The Romans, when they inherited Greek mythology, kept Lamia but transformed her yet again. Roman poets like Horace mention Lamia as a stock character, a nurse's tale to scare children into obedience. Be good, or Lamia will get you became a common threat. The Roman Lamia is less tragic, less sympathetic. She's more like a generic bogeyman, a tool of discipline rather than a complex psychological figure. But in Roman North Africa, closer to Lamia's supposed origin in Libya, the myth retained more of its original power. There, Lamia was still actively feared, still given offerings and sacrifices to appease her wrath. Archaeological evidence suggests that temples to protective deities against child-stealing demons remained popular throughout the Roman period in North African provinces. People still believed. People still feared. As Christianity spread across the Mediterranean world, Lamia underwent yet another transformation. Early Christian writers, looking to demonize pagan beliefs, seized upon creatures like Lamia as proof of Satan's influence in the pre-Christian world. She became a demon in a more technical sense, a servant of hell, an enemy of God. But interestingly, the Christians didn't erase her. They incorporated her into their own demonology. Medieval bestiaries, those illustrated encyclopedias of real and mythical creatures, include Lamia alongside dragons and unicorns. These Christian texts describe her as a devil who seduces men and murders children, an agent of Satan working to corrupt souls and destroy innocence. The mythology remains remarkably consistent even as the religious context changes completely. Lamia's core attributes, child murder and seduction, are too powerful, too archetypal to be abandoned. And this is where we need to talk about Lilith, because the connections between Lamia and Jewish demonology are absolutely fascinating. Lilith, in Jewish folklore, is strikingly similar to Lamia. She's described as the first wife of Adam, before Eve, who refused to submit to him and was cast out of Eden. Like Lamia, she becomes a child-killing demon. Like Lamia, she seduces sleeping men. The parallels are so strong that many scholars believe the myths influenced each other, spreading across the ancient Mediterranean as trade and cultural exchange brought different peoples into contact. There's a concept in comparative mythology called the primal demoness, a female figure who represents chaos, sexuality, and danger to children. She appears in Sumerian mythology as Lamishtu, in Babylonian texts as Lilitu, in Greek myth as Lamia, in Jewish folklore as Lilith, in Arabic tradition as Al-Qarina. The names change, the specific details vary, but the core concept remains astonishingly consistent across thousands of years and thousands of miles. Why? What is it about this particular female demon that resonates so powerfully across so many cultures? The answer, I think, lies in the fundamental anxieties of human civilization. Every human society must deal with three crucial challenges: successfully reproducing and raising children, controlling sexuality so that paternity is clear and families are stable, and managing the irrational, emotional, uncontrollable aspects of human nature. Lamia and her variants represent the failure of all three. She's a mother who kills children. She's a woman whose sexuality is uncontrolled and deadly. And she's pure emotion and irrationality made manifest. She's everything civilization fears about itself. She's what happens when grief isn't processed healthily. She's what happens when sexuality isn't channeled into approved relationships. She's what happens when women aren't controlled by patriarchal structures. This isn't to say that the ancients consciously understood all this. But myths aren't created consciously. They bubble up from the collective unconscious, from shared human experiences and fears. And Lamia bubbles up again and again because the fears she represents are universal. Let's jump forward to the medieval period, because Lamia doesn't vanish with the fall of Rome. She persists throughout the Middle Ages, appearing in various forms in European folklore. In Italy, there are stories of the Striga, witches who steal children and drain men's life force. In Spain, the Guaxas are similar creatures. In Eastern Europe, the Strigoi and Moroaica fulfill the same role. All of these can be traced back, at least in part, to the Lamia myth. Medieval monks, copying and preserving ancient texts, kept the name and stories of Lamia alive in scholarly circles. But more importantly, the folk belief in child-stealing night demons persisted in oral tradition among common people. Mothers still hung charms. Families still performed protective rituals. The church might have condemned these practices as pagan superstition, but people did them anyway because the fear was too primal, too urgent to ignore. And here's something disturbing. The witch trials of early modern Europe drew heavily on these ancient demon myths. When inquisitors and witch hunters described the crimes of witches, they described them as Lamia-like creatures who murdered babies and seduced men through demonic sexuality. The characteristics of Lamia became the template for what a witch was supposed to be. Thousands of women were tortured and executed based, in part, on a mythology that stretches back to ancient Greece. This is the dark power of myth. It doesn't just entertain us. It shapes how we see the world, how we categorize good and evil, and how we identify danger. And when a myth is as old and as widespread as Lamia, it becomes embedded in our cultural DNA. It influences us even when we don't consciously know the story. But let's return to the ancient world and explore some of the specific stories and encounters with Lamia that were recorded. Because there are some absolutely chilling tales that have survived in various sources, fragments of a larger oral tradition that must have been far richer and more detailed than what remains to us now. One story comes from the Greek magical papyri I mentioned earlier. It describes a man named Euphronius who encounters a Lamia while traveling at night. He's walking along a lonely road when he sees a beautiful woman standing beside a well. She's dressed in fine clothes, wearing jewelry, looking entirely out of place in the wilderness. She calls to him, asking for help. Her cart has broken, she says, and she needs assistance to continue her journey. Euphronius, being a gentleman, approaches to help. As he gets closer, he notices something strange. The woman casts no shadow despite the bright moonlight. Her feet don't quite touch the ground, and her eyes, while beautiful, reflect the moonlight like an animal's eyes, glowing with an inner luminescence. He realizes, just in time, that this is no ordinary woman. Euphronius speaks a protective charm he learned from his grandmother, invoking Hecate, goddess of magic and crossroads, protect her against night demons. The effect is immediate. The beautiful woman's face contorts with rage. She hisses like a serpent. Her form begins to shift, to reveal her true nature. But the charm holds her at bay. She cannot approach him. Frustrated, screaming curses, the Lamia transforms fully into her serpent form and slithers away into the darkness. Euphronius survives, but he's forever changed by the encounter. The text says he never traveled alone at night again, and he taught the protective charm to everyone he met, trying to save others from the fate he narrowly escaped. Another story, this one from a later Byzantine source, tells of a monk who encounters a Lamia in the desert. The monk is on a spiritual retreat, fasting and praying in the wilderness, when a woman appears before him. She's unimaginably beautiful, dressed in silks that seem to shimmer in the harsh desert sun. She offers him water, food, shelter from the heat. She speaks to him in a voice like honey, promising comfort and pleasure. But the monk recognizes temptation when he sees it. He spent years training to resist such things. He makes the sign of the cross and begins to pray. The woman's expression changes from seduction to fury. She reveals herself as a Lamia, sent by the devil to corrupt the holy man. But his faith protects him. She cannot touch him, cannot harm him. Finally, screaming in frustration, she vanishes in a cloud of sulfurous smoke. These stories follow a pattern. The Lamia appears as a beautiful woman in an unlikely place. She offers something the victim needs or wants. The victim almost falls into the trap, but is saved by magic, religion, or wisdom at the last moment. The Lamia is revealed and repelled. It's a teaching narrative, a cautionary tale designed to warn people about the dangers of trusting appearances and the importance of spiritual or magical protection. But not all Lamia encounters end well. There are also stories of victims who don't escape. Men who follow the beautiful woman into the wilderness and are never seen again. Babies who stop breathing in the night despite all their mother's protective charms. These stories serve a different purpose. They remind people that danger is real, that evil exists, that no amount of caution can guarantee safety. There's a particularly disturbing tale from ancient Thebes about a woman named Cleotha who became convinced that her neighbor was actually a Lamia in disguise. Cleotha's own child had died of what we would now recognize as a childhood illness, but she blamed the neighbor, a foreign woman from Thrace who had no children of her own. Cleotha began to spread rumors, to accuse the woman of being a demon. The community, already suspicious of outsiders, believed her. The Thracian woman was attacked by a mob. They dragged her from her home and killed her, claiming they were protecting their children from a Lamia. When they examined her body afterward, of course, they found no evidence of demonic nature. She was just a woman, a foreigner, someone different enough to be feared and blamed. The myth of Lamia had given them permission to act on their xenophobia and cruelty. This is the dangerous side of mythological belief. When we make our fears into monsters, we risk seeing monsters everywhere. When we have a category called child-killing demon, we might be tempted to place real people into that category, with horrific consequences. But let's shift gears and talk about Lamia's place in ancient art and literature, because she was a popular subject for artists and writers throughout antiquity. Unfortunately, most ancient visual representations of Lamia have been lost to time. We have descriptions of paintings and sculptures that no longer exist, destroyed by weather, war, or the simple passage of centuries. However, some images survive. There are ancient Greek vases that depict serpent-tailed women who are almost certainly Lamia, showing them attacking children or seducing men. The artistic style is quite horrifying. The artists didn't shy away from depicting the violence, the moment of attack, the terror of the victims. These weren't decorative pieces. They were warnings, reminders of danger, similar to how we might display a beware of dog sign today. Roman mosaics sometimes include Lamia figures as well, usually in the context of mythological scenes or as apotropaic images, meaning images meant to ward off evil by depicting the evil itself. The logic was that if you showed the demon, it couldn't actually approach because its likeness was already present, fulfilling its need to manifest. It's a fascinating piece of magical thinking. In literature, Lamia appears in various forms across many different genres. Greek tragedy occasionally referenced her as a monster that heroes might face. Comedy used her as a punchline, as we've discussed. Philosophy employed her as a metaphor for illusion and deception, the way reality can be distorted by desire or fear. And in popular literature, the penny dreadfuls of the ancient world, Lamia was a stock villain, a reliable source of scares. One of the most interesting literary uses of Lamia comes from the ancient novel The Life of Apollonius of Tyana by Philostratus, which I mentioned earlier. But I want to dig deeper into that story because it reveals so much about ancient attitudes toward women, foreigners, and the nature of reality itself. In this tale, young Menippus is traveling when he encounters the beautiful woman. She claims to be a wealthy Phoenician, another detail that's significant because Phoenicians were seen as exotic, foreign, and potentially dangerous in the Greek worldview. She invites him to her home, which is described as luxurious beyond belief. Gold and silver everywhere. The finest foods, the best wines, beautiful attendants catering to every need. Menippus is completely seduced, not just sexually, but intellectually and emotionally. He believes he's found paradise, found love, found wealth beyond imagination. He abandons his philosophical studies to spend all his time with this woman. His teacher, Apollonius, hears about this and comes to investigate. He's immediately suspicious. Everything about the situation is too perfect, too good to be true. At the wedding feast, Apollonius begins to question the woman publicly. Where does her wealth come from? Who is her family? Why has no one in the city heard of her before Menippus arrived? She tries to deflect, to change the subject, but Apollonius is relentless. He points out inconsistencies in her story. He notes that none of the servants ever speaks, that the food has no smell, and that the gold feels lighter than it should. Finally, he declares her a Lamia, a demon who has ensnared Menippus to devour him. At this pronouncement, the illusion begins to collapse. The house, which seems so solid and real, shimmers and fades. The gold turns to clay. The wine turns to water. The food vanishes entirely. And the woman herself transforms, her beautiful features melting away to reveal the monster beneath. She admits the truth. She was fattening Menippus up, literally and figuratively, feeding him pleasure and luxury until he was ripe for consumption. She planned to drain every drop of his life force, his youth, his vitality, leaving behind a withered husk. But here's what makes this story so compelling. Menippus, even after seeing the truth, doesn't want to believe it. He clings to the illusion. He insists that the woman he loves is real, that the house is real, and that Apollonius is wrong or lying. It takes the Lamia herself admitting her nature to finally break the spell. And even then, Menippus is devastated. He's lost not just a lover, but an entire fantasy of happiness and wealth. This story works on multiple levels. On the surface, it's a cautionary tale about the danger of beautiful women who seem too good to be true. But it's also about the power of illusion, about how desire can blind us to reality, about how we can become so invested in our fantasies that we resist seeing the truth even when it's right in front of us. And it's about the role of wisdom, embodied by Apollonius, in cutting through illusion to reveal harsh truths. The story also reflects ancient anxieties about foreign women and foreign wealth. The Lamia presents herself as Phoenician, exotic, bringing luxury from distant lands. This would have resonated with Greek audiences who were both attracted to and suspicious of foreign trade and foreign influence. The message is clear. What comes from outside, especially when it seems too good to be true, is dangerous. Stick with what you know. Trust your own people. Beware of exotic temptation. Now, let's talk about how Lamia connects to vampire mythology, because the parallels are striking and have led many scholars to trace vampire legends back to ancient Greek sources. Lamia drinks blood in many versions of her myth. She attacks at night. She can appear beautiful and seductive. She drains her victim's life force. These are all characteristics we associate with vampires. The Romans picked up on these vampiric elements and expanded them. Roman authors describe Lamiae who sleep during the day and hunt at night, who cannot enter a home unless invited, who can be repelled by certain herbs and protective symbols. If you're familiar with vampire lore, these details should sound very familiar. They're the foundation of what would eventually become the elaborate vampire mythology of Eastern Europe and, eventually, modern popular culture. In fact, some scholars argue that Lamia is the original vampire, the prototype from which all other blood-drinking undead evolved. The etymological connection between Lamia and similar creatures across different cultures supports this theory. The Serbian Lamja, the Bulgarian Lamia, the Albanian Lubia, all likely derive from the Greek Lamia and all describe vampire-like creatures. But there's a crucial difference. Vampires, at least in modern interpretation, are usually portrayed as tragic figures. They're cursed, suffering, often unwilling monsters. They drink blood out of necessity, not choice. Lamia, in contrast, is driven by revenge and grief. She chooses violence. She wants to hurt people. There's an agency and intentionality to Lamia that makes her, in some ways, more disturbing than a vampire. Though, as we've discussed, that agency is complicated by the trauma that created her. Is she really choosing to be a monster? Or has Hera's curse stripped away her ability to choose? It's a question the ancient myths don't clearly answer, and that ambiguity is part of what makes Lamia such an enduring figure. Let's explore the psychological dimension of the Lamia myth more deeply, because I think this is where the story becomes genuinely profound. At its core, the Lamia myth is about trauma and how it transforms us. It's about the psychology of grief taken to its absolute extreme. When Lamia loses her children, she experiences what psychologists call complicated grief or traumatic grief. This is grief so severe that it doesn't follow the normal process of healing. Instead of gradually accepting the loss and finding a way to continue living, the grieving person becomes stuck. They cannot move forward. The loss defines their entire existence. In complicated grief, the person often experiences intrusive thoughts about the deceased. They relive the loss over and over. They cannot escape their memories. This mirrors Hera's curse that prevents Lamia from closing her eyes, which forces her to remain always conscious of her loss. The myth is a perfect metaphor for how traumatic grief feels, like you can never sleep, never escape, never stop seeing what you've lost. Additionally, people experiencing complicated grief often feel intense anger, both at themselves and at the world. Why did this happen? Why wasn't it prevented? Who's to blame? This anger can become all-consuming, can transform into a desire for revenge against anyone who still has what you lost. Lamia's child-killing spree is an externalization of this psychological state. She's not just sad, she's furious, and she wants everyone to suffer as she suffers. There's also an element of what psychologists call magical thinking in Lamia's behavior. On some level, she seems to believe that if she kills enough children, if she spreads enough suffering, something will change. Maybe her own children will come back. Maybe the pain will stop. Maybe she'll feel something other than rage and grief. Of course, it doesn't work. It can't work. But trauma isn't logical. It doesn't respond to reason. Modern psychology also recognizes a condition called complex PTSD, which develops after prolonged or repeated trauma. One of the symptoms is distorted self-perception. The person sees themselves as fundamentally damaged, broken, and less than human. Lamia's physical transformation into a monster can be understood as a literal representation of this psychological state. She feels like a monster, so she becomes a monster. The external matches the internal. Her predatory sexuality, the aspect of her mythology that involves seducing and killing men, also makes psychological sense through a trauma lens. Sexual trauma, or trauma that involves violation of bodily autonomy, often results in complicated relationships with sexuality. Some survivors completely avoid sexual contact. Others become hypersexual, using sex as a way to reclaim control or to feel something other than numbness. Lamia's weaponized sexuality falls into this second category. She uses sex to assert power, to control, to harm. It's not about pleasure or connection. It's about revenge and dominance. The myth even captures the way trauma can make people dangerous to those around them. Unprocessed trauma doesn't just hurt the person experiencing it. It radiates outward. It affects relationships. It can lead to behaviors that harm others, especially vulnerable others. Lamia doesn't just suffer from her trauma. She inflicts it on innocents. This is tragically realistic. Hurt people, as the saying goes. Now, I want to be very clear. I'm not saying that the ancient Greeks understood trauma in modern psychological terms. They didn't have our vocabulary or our theoretical frameworks. But they observed human behavior. They saw how grief could break someone. They watched people self-destruct under the weight of loss. And they created myths that captured these observations in narrative form. The Lamia myth is one of the most psychologically accurate portraits of severe trauma in all of ancient mythology. It shows us grief that doesn't heal, anger that becomes murderous, sexuality that becomes predatory, and identity that becomes monstrous. It's a complete picture of what happens when trauma isn't processed, when there's no support, no healing, no path forward. It's a warning about what we can become when we're broken beyond repair. But the myth also does something interesting. It makes Lamia's trauma visible. Her transformation from woman to monster is external, obvious, and impossible to ignore. In reality, traumatized people often don't look different. They suffer invisibly. The myth gives form to invisible pain, makes it something that can be seen, fought, or fled from. In doing so, it acknowledges that trauma is real, that it's dangerous, that it requires action and response. This brings us to an important question. Are there any redemptive elements in the Lamia myth? Is there any hope for her? Can she be saved, healed, or restored? The answer, unfortunately, is mostly no. In the vast majority of versions of the story, Lamia is simply a monster to be avoided or destroyed. She's beyond help, beyond salvation. There are a few exceptions, a few versions that suggest the possibility of redemption. In some very late retellings, influenced by Christian ideas of forgiveness and redemption, Lamia is given the opportunity to repent. If she can genuinely feel remorse for her crimes, if she can choose mercy over revenge, she might be restored to human form. But these versions are rare and lack the mythological weight of the older, darker stories. The truth is, the ancient Greeks didn't really believe in redemption the way we do today. Their worldview was more tragic, more fatalistic. Once you become a monster, that's what you were. You could be defeated, but you couldn't be changed. This reflects a deeply pessimistic view of human nature and the permanence of trauma. Some wounds, the myths tell us, cannot be healed. Some transformations cannot be reversed. This is actually one of the more disturbing aspects of the Lamia myth when we look at it closely. There's no escape clause for her. She's trapped in her monstrous form, driven by rage and grief for eternity. Even death isn't an option. She's a demon, a spirit, something that exists outside normal mortality. Her suffering is endless, and the suffering she causes is endless. It's a perfect hell, both for her and her victims. But perhaps that's the point. Perhaps the myth is meant to be horrifying precisely because it offers no hope. It's not a teaching story about how to overcome trauma. It's a warning about what happens when trauma isn't addressed. It's about prevention, not cure. Don't let things get to the Lamia point. Don't allow grief to transform into rage. Don't permit loss to destroy your humanity. Because once you cross that line, there may be no coming back. Let's look now at how the Lamia myth influenced later Western literature and culture, because her impact extends far beyond ancient Greece. We've already mentioned Keats' poem Lamia, which is probably the most famous modern literary treatment of the myth. But there are countless other examples across different time periods and genres. During the Romantic period of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, there was a huge revival of interest in classical mythology, particularly its darker elements. Romantic poets and writers loved the Lamia figure because she embodied their key themes: the conflict between reason and passion, the danger and allure of female sexuality, the thin line between beauty and horror, and the power of illusion and imagination. Keats' poem, written in 1819, takes the Philostratus story but makes it far more sympathetic to Lamia. In Keats' version, she genuinely loves Menippus. She's transformed from a serpent into a woman by the god Hermes, not to deceive, but to experience human love. When Apollonius reveals her true nature at the wedding feast, she doesn't transform into a monster in Keats' telling. She simply vanishes, dissolved by the harsh light of philosophical reason. Menippus, unable to live without her, dies of heartbreak. It's a radical reimagining that makes philosophy the villain and Lamia the tragic heroine. Keats was arguing that cold rationality destroys beauty and love, that sometimes illusion is preferable to truth. It's a very romantic idea, and it represents a complete inversion of the ancient moral of the story. This sympathetic treatment of Lamia influenced many later writers. Victorian authors, in particular, were fascinated by the idea of the beautiful monster, the tragic demon who didn't choose her nature. You can see Lamia's influence in characters like Carmilla, the vampire from Sheridan Le Fanu's novella. Like Lamia, Carmilla is beautiful, seductive, predatory, and ultimately tragic. She kills not out of evil, but out of need. In modern fantasy literature, Lamia-type creatures appear frequently. Sometimes they're called by that name, sometimes by other names, but the basic template remains the same. Beautiful woman, serpentine lower body, dangerous, often tragic. The Medusa mythology, which has some overlap with Lamia, has also remained popular, appearing in everything from Clash of the Titans to Percy Jackson to contemporary feminist reinterpretations. Horror cinema has made extensive use of Lamia imagery, even when the creature isn't called by that name. Any horror film featuring a female monster who kills children or seduces men is drawing, consciously or not, from the Lamia tradition. The creature in Mama, the demon in Insidious, and the ghost in The Woman in Black all echo Lamia's characteristics. Modern urban fantasy has been particularly interested in Lamia. Jim Butcher's Dresden Files series features Lamia-like creatures. Laurel K. Hamilton's Anita Blake series includes them. In these contemporary treatments, Lamia is usually a species rather than an individual, and they're often more complex than simple monsters. They might have their own societies, their own moral codes, their own justifications for their behavior. This evolution reflects changing attitudes toward monsters in general. Modern audiences want their monsters to have depth, motivation, and psychological complexity. We're less comfortable with pure evil, more interested in shades of gray. So Lamia, who already had a tragic origin story built into her myth, is perfect for this kind of treatment. Video games have also embraced Lamia. In the Castlevania series, Lamia appears as a recurring boss enemy. In Dungeons & Dragons and related role-playing games, Lamia is a monster type with detailed ecology and behavior. In Monster Hunter, Lamia-inspired creatures are major opponents. The gaming world has thoroughly integrated her into its mythology. What's fascinating is how persistent the core elements remain even as the context changes completely. Whether it's ancient Greece, romantic poetry, Victorian horror, or modern video games, Lamia is always serpentine, always female, always dangerous, always connected to sexuality and children. The template is remarkably stable across 3,000 years of cultural evolution. This stability suggests that Lamia taps into something fundamental in human psychology. She represents fears and anxieties that don't change much across time and culture. The fear of losing a child, the fear of predatory sexuality, the fear of beautiful things that are actually dangerous. These are human universals, and Lamia embodies all of them. Now I want to discuss the feminist readings of the Lamia myth, because this is an area where interpretation has evolved significantly in recent decades. Traditional readings of Lamia, particularly from male scholars, tended to take the myth at face value. Lamia is a monster, a cautionary tale about dangerous women, an embodiment of male fears about female sexuality and maternal power. But feminist scholars have offered alternative readings that are much more sympathetic to Lamia and more critical of the patriarchal structures embedded in the myth. From this perspective, Lamia is not a monster, but a victim. She's punished for Zeus's crime. Her children are murdered not because of anything she did wrong, but because Hera, rather than confronting her powerful husband, takes out her jealousy on a vulnerable mortal woman. This is a pattern throughout Greek mythology. Zeus rapes or seduces countless mortal women. Hera punishes the women, never Zeus. Io is turned into a cow and tormented. Callisto is turned into a bear. Semele is tricked into death. And Lamia has her children murdered and is driven to madness. The patriarchal system protects men, even when they're clearly at fault, and blames women for their own victimization. From this feminist reading, Lamia's transformation into a monster is not a moral judgment, but a realistic depiction of what patriarchal violence does to women. When society strips away your children, your identity, your humanity, you become monstrous not because you're inherently evil, but because you've been broken by systemic cruelty. Lamia's child killing can be understood not as her fault, but as the inevitable result of what was done to her. Some feminist scholars go further, arguing that the fear of Lamia represents male anxiety about female power. She's a woman who refuses to be controlled, who uses her sexuality as a weapon rather than accepting it as something for men to take. She's a mother who rejects the maternal role, who kills rather than nurtures. In a patriarchal society that demands women be chaste, maternal, and obedient, Lamia represents the terrifying possibility that women might refuse those roles. There's also an interesting feminist reading of the dual nature of Lamia as both child killer and seductress. These seem like opposite archetypes, the anti-mother and the hypersexual woman. But they're actually two sides of the same patriarchal anxiety. Both represent women who refuse their designated social function. The good woman, in patriarchal logic, is a mother who devotes herself entirely to her children, suppressing her own sexuality and desires. Lamia violates both halves of this equation. She's sexually active outside approved channels, and she destroys children rather than nurturing them. By combining these two violations in one figure, the myth creates the ultimate patriarchal nightmare. A woman completely free of male control, using her sexuality and her maternal capacity however she chooses, with no regard for male authority or social expectations. That this figure is portrayed as a horrifying demon tells us everything we need to know about how patriarchal societies view female autonomy. Contemporary feminist retellings of the Lamia myth have explored these themes explicitly. Some writers have reimagined Lamia as a heroic figure, striking back against the gods who wronged her. Others have focused on her grief and trauma, making her a sympathetic character trying to survive in a world that has destroyed everything she loved. Still others have reclaimed her sexuality, portraying her seductions not as predatory, but as empowering, as a woman taking control of her own desire. These reinterpretations don't erase the horror of Lamia's actions, particularly her child killing, but they contextualize them differently. They ask us to consider what we would do in her position, whether we might not also become monstrous if subjected to such cruelty. They challenge the easy moral certainty of the original myth and force us to grapple with more complex questions about justice, revenge, trauma, and responsibility. There's also a racial dimension to the Lamia myth that deserves attention. Lamia is explicitly Libyan, from North Africa. She's not Greek. This foreignness is emphasized in many versions of the story. And there's a troubling pattern in Greek mythology where foreign women are more likely to be portrayed as dangerous, deceptive, or monstrous. Medea, from Colchis, is a sorceress who kills her own children. Circe, possibly also from the east, turns men into pigs. The Sirens, whose origin is ambiguous, lure sailors to their deaths. And Lamia, from Libya, becomes a child-killing demon. The pattern suggests that Greek anxiety about foreign peoples, particularly foreign women, was encoded into their mythology. From this perspective, the Lamia myth can be read as a xenophobic narrative, one that warns Greek audiences not to trust exotic foreigners, especially beautiful foreign women who might seem appealing but are actually dangerous. This reading doesn't excuse Lamia's actions in the myth, but it does help us understand the cultural work the myth was doing, the social boundaries it was policing. Modern retellings that are conscious of these racial and ethnic dimensions have tried to complicate this aspect of the story. Some have focused on Lamia's African heritage, connecting her to other African mythological traditions and exploring what the myth might mean from a non-Greek perspective. Others have challenged the portrayal of foreignness as inherently threatening, reimagining Lamia as a victim of Greek imperialism and cultural prejudice. These various critical approaches, feminist, post-colonial, and psychological, don't replace the traditional understanding of the Lamia myth. Instead, they add layers of meaning, helping us see how myths function in their social contexts and how they continue to evolve as those contexts change. The Lamia myth is rich enough, complex enough, to support multiple interpretations, and that multiplicity is part of what has kept the myth alive for 3,000 years. Let me now address the connection between Lamia and real historical practices, because some aspects of the myth may be rooted in actual ancient customs and beliefs. The practice of blaming infant mortality on demons wasn't just superstition in the sense of baseless fear. It was a way of coping with tragedy in a world before medical science could explain what was happening. Sudden infant death syndrome, which we still don't fully understand today, must have been absolutely terrifying to ancient parents. A baby who was perfectly healthy goes to sleep and simply doesn't wake up. No visible cause. No warning. How do you process that? How do you prevent it from happening again? The Lamia myth gave people an answer. It wasn't random. It wasn't your fault. It was a demon. And demons can be fought with the right protective measures. The same logic applies to complications in childbirth. Before modern medicine, childbirth was extraordinarily dangerous for both mother and infant. When things went wrong, when a baby died during or shortly after birth, attributing it to Lamia gave people a sense of agency, however false. They could do rituals, hang charms, and make offerings to protective deities. These actions didn't actually reduce mortality rates, but they reduced anxiety and helplessness, which is its own kind of value. There's also evidence that some aspects of Lamia mythology may be connected to practices of infanticide or child abandonment in the ancient world. In ancient Greece and Rome, unwanted infants, particularly girls or children born with disabilities, were sometimes left to die in the wilderness. This practice, called exposure, was legal and not particularly stigmatized in many periods. Some scholars have suggested that the Lamia myth may have been used to explain or justify these deaths. If a family exposed an infant and the child died, attributing the death to Lamia rather than to deliberate abandonment would absolve the family of guilt. The demon killed the child, not human action. This is speculative, but it's an intriguing possibility that adds another dark layer to the myth. The seduction aspect of Lamia mythology may also have historical roots. Nocturnal emissions, erotic dreams, and sleep paralysis have all been attributed to demonic visitation across many cultures. When men woke up from erotic dreams, particularly dreams that involved women who weren't their wives, blaming a demon like Lamia was socially useful. It wasn't your fault that you had impure thoughts. A demon seduced you while you slept. Sleep paralysis, a condition where people wake up but temporarily can't move, often involves vivid hallucinations of a presence in the room, sometimes sitting on the chest, sometimes erotic in nature. These experiences have been attributed to demons, aliens, ghosts, and other supernatural entities across different cultures. In ancient Greece, Lamia and similar demons were the explanation. The symptoms match remarkably well. The sense of a presence, the inability to move, the feeling of pressure, sometimes erotic sensations, and terrifying visions. So while Lamia herself is mythological, the experiences that were attributed to her were real. People did have these experiences, did lose children in unexplained ways, did have disturbing dreams and sleep phenomena. The Lamia myth provided a framework for understanding and coping with these frightening realities. This brings us to an important point about how we should approach ancient mythology. It's easy to dismiss these stories as primitive superstition, as evidence of how ignorant our ancestors were. But that's both arrogant and inaccurate. The people who believed in Lamia weren't stupid. They were doing the best they could with the knowledge and tools available to them. They were creating explanatory frameworks that helped them navigate a dangerous and often incomprehensible world. We have the luxury of scientific knowledge, of understanding disease, psychology, and sleep phenomena in ways the ancients couldn't. But that doesn't mean their myths were worthless. They served crucial psychological and social functions. They helped people process grief and fear. They reinforced social norms and boundaries. They preserved cultural knowledge. And they created powerful narratives that continue to resonate because they tap into universal human experiences. Let's turn our attention now to the specific rituals and protective measures that were used against Lamia in the ancient world, because these are fascinating and reveal a lot about ancient magical thinking. As I mentioned earlier, there are actual surviving documents, magical papyri and amulets, that contain spells and instructions for protection against child-killing demons. One common protective measure was the use of iron. Demons were believed to fear cold iron, and hanging iron objects, particularly iron nails or small horseshoes, above a child's bed was considered effective protection. This belief persisted well into the medieval period and beyond. Even today, some folk traditions maintain that iron wards off evil. Another common protection was light. Keeping a lamp or candle burning all night was believed to repel demons who preferred darkness. This practice had the practical benefit of making it easier for parents to check on their child, but the ancients believed the light itself was magically protective. Certain herbs were also considered effective against Lamia. Garlic, rue, and vervain all appear in protective spells. These herbs would be hung in bundles over the crib or burned as incense to purify the air. Interestingly, many of these herbs have genuine antimicrobial or insect-repelling properties, so while they didn't actually ward off demons, they may have reduced disease transmission in minor ways. Spoken charms and prayers were crucial. There are recorded invocations to various protective deities: Artemis, goddess of childbirth; Hecate, goddess of magic and crossroads; Hermes, the messenger god who could ward off evil. Parents would recite these prayers over their children, particularly at night before sleep. The act of prayer provided comfort and a sense of active protection. Physical amulets were extremely common. Small objects inscribed with protective symbols or deities would be hung around an infant's neck or above the crib. Archaeological excavations have found numerous examples of these amulets, often depicting protective goddesses or symbols like the eye that wards off evil, similar to the evil eye belief that persists in Mediterranean cultures today. Some protective rituals were more elaborate. One spell instructs the mother to draw a circle around the child's bed using a mixture of salt and ground herbs while reciting a specific incantation. The circle creates a boundary that demons cannot cross. Another ritual involves washing the child with water that has been blessed or charged with protective magic, similar to baptism in later Christian tradition. There were also community rituals. In some Greek communities, there were regular festivals where protective offerings were made to the gods on behalf of all the community's children. These rituals reinforced social bonds, reminded everyone of their shared vulnerability, and provided collective reassurance that something was being done to protect the young. What's striking about all of these protections is how much they resemble rituals from other cultures and time periods. The specifics vary, But the basic categories of protection remain the same: barriers of iron or salt, purification through smoke or water, invocations of protective powers, amulets and charms, light and darkness. This universality suggests that these practices tap into deep psychological needs for control, for ritual action in the face of helplessness. From a modern perspective, we can see that none of these measures would actually protect against disease, SIDS, or any other real danger to infants. But they provided something arguably just as important. They reduced parental anxiety, they encouraged vigilance and attentive care, and they created a sense of agency. Parents who performed these rituals felt like they were doing something, and that psychological comfort had real value. Moreover, some of the protective measures did have indirect benefits. Keeping a light burning encouraged parents to check on the child regularly. Maintaining cleanliness as part of purification rituals reduced disease transmission. Communal rituals built social networks that could provide support in times of crisis. The magic might have been an illusion, but the practical effects were sometimes real. Now I want to discuss the role of Lamia in ancient drama and performance, because she wasn't just a figure in written texts. She was performed, enacted, and brought to life on stage and in ritual contexts. Unfortunately, as with so much of ancient performance, we have very limited direct evidence. No ancient Greek plays focused specifically on Lamia have survived in their entirety, though we have fragments and references that suggest such plays existed. We know from various sources that Lamia was used in Greek comedy as a figure of fun, as I mentioned earlier. Aristophanes and other comic playwrights would have actors dressed as Lamia, probably with exaggerated serpent costumes and frightening masks, terrorizing other characters for comic effect. The humor would have come from the gap between the terrifying reputation and the obviously artificial theatrical representation. But Lamia also appeared in more serious contexts. There are references to tragedies that dealt with her story, focusing on her original transformation from woman to monster. These plays would have explored the tragic dimensions of her myth, her loss, her grief, her inexorable descent into monstrosity. We can imagine choruses singing laments for her murdered children, actors delivering powerful speeches about the cruelty of the gods, and stunning visual effects as Lamia's transformation was portrayed on stage. Greek theater relied heavily on masks and costumes to create visual impact, and a Lamia mask would have been truly terrifying. Large, covering the entire head, probably with snake-like features, glowing eyes, achieved through some clever use of material that caught the light, and an open mouth showing fangs. When an actor wearing such a mask moved across the stage, particularly in the flickering light of torches, the effect would have been genuinely frightening. There's also evidence of ritual performances involving Lamia and similar demons. These weren't theater in the sense of entertainment, but religious rituals designed to ward off evil. Priests or priestesses would dress as the demon, enact the demon's attack, and then perform the ritual banishment or binding of the demon. These apotropaic rituals were meant to have a real magical effect, not just to entertain. In later Roman pantomime, a form of solo performance where a single actor would portray multiple characters through dance and gesture while a chorus sang the story, Lamia was a popular subject. The transformations from beautiful woman to serpent demon would have been conveyed through movement and costume changes, creating a spectacular visual experience. These performance traditions kept the Lamia myth alive in popular consciousness in ways that written texts alone could not. Seeing Lamia performed, watching the transformation, hearing the laments, experiencing the fear and pathos, would have made the myth visceral and immediate in a way that simply hearing or reading the story could not match. This performative dimension of the myth also allowed for constant reinterpretation and adaptation. Each new production could emphasize different aspects, could make Lamia more or less sympathetic, could focus on the horror or the tragedy. The myth remained fluid, dynamic, and responsive to changing cultural attitudes and audience expectations. Let me now address the connection between Lamia and another famous Greek monster, Medusa, because there are significant parallels and the two myths may share common origins. Both Lamia and Medusa are female monsters with serpentine features. Both were once beautiful women who were transformed as punishment for sexual contact with gods. Both are associated with petrification or paralysis, the inability of victims to escape. And both have become iconic representations of dangerous female power in Western culture. Medusa's story is well known. She was a beautiful woman, in some versions a priestess of Athena. Poseidon raped her in Athena's temple. Athena, rather than punishing Poseidon, punished Medusa by transforming her into a monster with snakes for hair, whose gaze turned people to stone. Like Lamia, Medusa is a victim who becomes a monster, a woman punished for a god's crime. The parallels are too strong to be coincidental. Both myths seem to be working through similar anxieties about female beauty, divine power, and sexual violence. Both suggest that women who are noticed by gods, whether they welcome that attention or not, will suffer for it. And both transform the victimized woman into a source of terror, as if female pain inevitably becomes dangerous to everyone around it. Some scholars have suggested that Lamia and Medusa may originally have been the same figure or variant traditions of a common prototype. The serpentine features, the transformation from beauty to monstrosity, and the association with both sexuality and death all point to shared mythological roots. Over time, the stories diverged, with Medusa's myth focusing more on the petrifying gaze and heroic conquest, while Lamia's myth emphasized child killing and seduction. Interestingly, both figures have been reclaimed by feminist scholars and artists as symbols of female rage and resistance. If Medusa and Lamia are read as victims who become agents of their own power, however destructively, they can be seen as prototypes for women who refuse to accept their victimization silently. Their monstrousness becomes a form of strength, a refusal to remain vulnerable. This reclamation has produced some fascinating contemporary art and literature. Visual artists have created images of Lamia and Medusa as powerful, defiant figures rather than simply terrifying ones. Writers have retold their stories from their perspectives, giving voice to their pain and rage. These reinterpretations don't erase the original myths, but add new layers of meaning, demonstrating how mythology continues to evolve in dialogue with contemporary concerns. Now let's consider the philosophical dimensions of the Lamia myth, because ancient philosophers used her as more than just a scary story. She became a symbol for various philosophical concepts, particularly those related to illusion, appearance versus reality, and the dangers of desire. The story of Menippus and the Lamia, which we've discussed, was used by philosophers to illustrate the power of illusion. The Lamia creates an entirely false reality, a house, wealth, love, and happiness. To Menippus, this illusion is completely convincing. Only someone with wisdom and philosophical training, like Apollonius, can see through it. The story becomes an allegory for how desire blinds us to truth, how what we want to be true can prevent us from seeing what is actually true. This connects to Platonic philosophy and the allegory of the cave. In Plato's famous allegory, prisoners chained in a cave mistake shadows for reality because they've never seen the real world outside. The Lamia's illusions function similarly. Menippus mistakes appearance for reality because he lacks the philosophical insight to perceive the truth. Only the philosopher can see beyond the shadows, beyond the illusions, to reality itself. Stoic philosophers also used Lamia as an example in their teachings about the dangers of passion and desire. The Stoics believed that emotional attachments and desires lead to suffering. A person who desires wealth, pleasure, or romantic love sets themselves up for disappointment and pain. Menippus, in desiring the beautiful woman and the luxurious life she offers, makes himself vulnerable to deception and destruction. A true Stoic would have maintained emotional detachment, would have seen through the illusion because he wouldn't have been clouded by desire in the first place. Skeptic philosophers, who questioned whether we can know anything with certainty, sometimes used Lamia to support their arguments. If a demon can create illusions so convincing that even a philosopher like Menippus is fooled, how can we trust our senses about anything? Maybe everything we experience is a Lamia-style illusion. Maybe reality itself is fundamentally unknowable. This is an extreme position, but it shows how the Lamia myth could be deployed in philosophical debate. Christian philosophers in late antiquity also found uses for the Lamia myth. They saw her as a demon, a servant of Satan, who uses illusion to lead souls away from God. The beautiful woman who is actually a monster became a perfect metaphor for sin itself, attractive on the surface, deadly at its core. The philosopher Apollonius who sees through the illusion becomes analogous to the Christian saint who resists temptation through faith and divine grace. What all these philosophical uses of the myth have in common is the idea that appearance can be dangerously misleading, that desire clouds judgment, and that wisdom or faith is required to perceive true reality. Lamia becomes a symbol for everything that deceives us, for the gap between what seems to be and what actually is. This philosophical dimension adds yet another layer to the myth's enduring power. Lamia isn't just a scary monster or a tragic victim. She's also an epistemological problem, a question about the nature of knowledge and reality. How do we know what's real? How do we distinguish truth from illusion? What role does desire play in shaping our perception? These are perennial philosophical questions, and Lamia provides a vivid narrative framework for exploring them. Let's turn now to the linguistic legacy of Lamia, because her name has persisted in various forms across multiple languages and cultures. The Greek word Lamia likely derives from lymos, meaning gullet or throat, emphasizing her devouring nature. This etymology connects her to other throat-based demon names across Indo-European languages. In Latin, Lamia was adopted directly, pronounced roughly the same way as in Greek. Roman authors used the term to describe witches, demons, and supernatural predators. The plural Lamiae became a general term for a class of demons, similar to how we might say vampires or demons today. Various European languages have related words. The Italian Lamia can mean both the mythological creature and, more generally, a witch or vampiric being. Spanish Lamia carries similar connotations. These Romance language terms have persisted into modern usage, appearing in everything from literary works to role-playing games. In Slavic languages, we find related terms like Lamia in Bulgarian and Lamja in Serbian. These creatures retain many of Lamia's characteristics. They're female, dangerous, often serpentine, and associated with death and seduction. The linguistic connection suggests significant cultural exchange between Greek and Slavic peoples in ancient and medieval times. Interestingly, Lamia's linguistic influence extends beyond creature names. The English word lament, meaning a passionate expression of grief, comes from the same Latin root. While not directly derived from Lamia, the creature, the etymological connection is suggestive. Lamia is, fundamentally, a figure of lament, eternally mourning her lost children. In modern scientific nomenclature, Lamia appears in various taxonomic names, particularly for snakes and serpentine creatures. There's a genus of sea snake called Lamia tree, and various species have been given names that reference the mythological Lamia. This scientific usage keeps the name alive in contemporary contexts, linking ancient mythology to modern biology. The name has also been used for geographical features, particularly in regions with a strong classical heritage. There are places named Lamia in Greece and other Mediterranean countries. The modern Greek city of Lamia, located in Thessaly, may or may not be named for the mythological figure. The etymology is unclear, but the association exists in popular imagination. In popular culture, Lamia has become a common name for snake-like or serpentine characters in fantasy settings. Video games, novels, comics, and films regularly use the name to denote a specific type of monster. Usually female, usually part snake, usually dangerous. The name has become a shorthand, instantly recognizable to audiences familiar with fantasy conventions. This linguistic persistence across thousands of years and dozens of languages is remarkable. It demonstrates how deeply Lamia has penetrated Western cultural consciousness. Her name carries weight, conveys specific associations, and evokes particular fears and fascinations. That's the mark of truly successful mythology, when the name alone can conjure an entire complex of meanings. Now I want to explore the connections between Lamia and concepts of female monstrosity more broadly, because she's part of a larger pattern in how cultures imagine dangerous women. Throughout mythology, folklore, and history, women who violate social norms, who refuse their designated roles, or who exercise power in ways deemed inappropriate are often portrayed as monsters. We've already discussed Medusa, but consider also the sirens who lure men to their deaths with beautiful singing, Scylla and Charybdis, female monsters who destroy ships, the harpies who steal food and spread filth, the furies who pursue and punish, the Sphinx who devours those who cannot answer her riddle. Greek mythology is full of female monsters, and they share common characteristics. They're often beautiful, often sexually dangerous, and often associated with death or destruction. This pattern isn't unique to Greece. Norse mythology has Hel, goddess of the underworld, and various female spirits who foretell death. Celtic mythology has the Banshee and the Morrigan. Japanese folklore has the Yuki-onna and the Fuda-kuchi-onna. Hindu mythology has Kali and various Rakshasi. Across cultures, female monstrosity is a persistent theme. What does this tell us? Some scholars argue that it reflects universal patriarchal anxiety about female power. In societies where men hold political, religious, and economic authority, the idea of women having power is threatening. Making female power monstrous is a way of containing that threat, of ensuring women stay in their subordinate roles. If powerful women are portrayed as demons and monsters, women will be discouraged from seeking power. Other scholars focus on more specific anxieties. The female monster often embodies fears about reproduction and sexuality. She might steal children or kill them, threatening the continuity of family and society. Or she might be hypersexual, threatening men's control over sexuality and paternity. Many female monsters combine both aspects, like Lamia, suggesting that maternal and sexual power are intimately connected in the cultural imagination. There's also an element of the abject in female monstrosity. The abject, in psychoanalytic theory, refers to things that blur the boundaries of the self, bodily fluids, decay, death, things that remind us that we're material, mortal, vulnerable. Female bodies, because they menstruate, lactate, and give birth, are more closely associated with the abject and patriarchal thinking. Female monsters often embody these abject qualities intensely. They leak, they consume, they contaminate, they decay. Lamia fits this pattern perfectly. She's maternal power gone wrong, turning from nurturing to destroying. She's sexual power that consumes rather than pleases. She's a body that's neither human nor animal, but horrifyingly both. She embodies multiple violations of patriarchal norms and physical boundaries simultaneously. But we should be careful not to reduce female monsters to simple patriarchal projections. These figures also have power, agency, and a certain feminist potential. They refuse domestication. They strike back at those who wrong them. They survive and persist despite being outcasts and demonized. In this sense, figures like Lamia can be read as proto-feminist, as women who refuse to accept their victimization and instead become agents of their own destiny, however destructive that destiny might be. Modern feminist writers and artists have seized on this ambiguity, creating works that celebrate female monsters as symbols of resistance. These reinterpretations don't excuse the violence of figures like Lamia, but contextualize it as a response to systemic oppression and abuse. They ask us to see the human pain behind the monstrous exterior, to understand the monster as someone who was made, not born. This brings me to a crucial point about mythology in general. Myths are not fixed. They're constantly being retold, reinterpreted, and reimagined for new contexts and audiences. The Lamia of ancient Greece, the Lamia of Keats' romantic poem, the Lamia of contemporary feminist literature, and the Lamia of modern video games are related but distinct figures. Each version serves different cultural needs, addresses different anxieties, and offers different meanings. This is why mythology remains relevant. It's not just ancient stories we've inherited. It's a living narrative tradition that evolves with us, that changes as our values and concerns change, but that retains core elements that speak to fundamental human experiences. Lamia has survived for 3,000 years because she embodies experiences and fears that remain relevant: grief, loss, trauma, the danger of beauty, the ambiguity of victimhood, and monstrosity. Let me now discuss the academic study of Lamia and similar figures, because there's a rich scholarly tradition analyzing these myths from various perspectives. Classicists have traced the development of the Lamia myth through ancient texts, identifying how the story changed over time and how it was used in different literary and social contexts. Anthropologists have compared Lamia to similar figures from other cultures, looking for universal patterns in how human societies conceptualize danger, particularly dangers to children. The fact that almost every culture has a child-stealing demon suggests this represents a universal human fear, one that transcends specific cultural boundaries. Psychologists and psychoanalysts have analyzed Lamia as a representation of various psychological complexes. Jungian analysts see her as a shadow archetype, representing repressed aspects of the feminine psyche. Freudian analysts focus on the oral aggression of her child-devouring and the Oedipal implications of her seduction of men. Trauma psychologists, as I've discussed, see her as a representation of how severe trauma can transform personality and behavior. Folklorists have documented the persistence of Lamia-type beliefs in modern Greece and other Mediterranean regions, showing how ancient mythology continues to influence contemporary folk practices. Even today, in some rural areas, parents may perform traditional rituals to protect children from demonic influence, rituals that would be recognizable to their ancient ancestors. Religious studies scholars have examined how the Lamia myth was integrated into Christian demonology and how it influenced concepts of witchcraft and demonic possession in medieval and early modern Europe. The transformation of pagan demons into Christian ones is a complex process, and Lamia is an excellent case study. Literary scholars have analyzed how the Lamia myth has been adapted in various literary works, from classical poetry to romantic verse to contemporary fantasy novels. They've shown how each adaptation reflects the values and concerns of its time, making Lamia a kind of cultural barometer, measuring changing attitudes toward women, sexuality, and monstrosity. Feminist scholars, as we've discussed extensively, have critiqued traditional interpretations of Lamia and offered alternative readings that center her victimization and resistance rather than her monstrosity. This feminist scholarship has significantly influenced contemporary adaptations of the myth. What all this scholarship demonstrates is that Lamia is not a simple or singular figure. She's a complex, multifaceted myth that can be productively analyzed from numerous angles. Each scholarly approach reveals different dimensions of the myth, different aspects of its meaning and function. This scholarly attention also ensures that Lamia remains part of educated discourse, that she's not forgotten or reduced to a mere Halloween costume. The myth is taught in university courses, discussed in academic journals, and presented at scholarly conferences. This academic engagement keeps the myth alive in ways that complement its presence in popular culture. Now, as we move toward the conclusion of our exploration, I want to reflect on what the Lamia myth teaches us about humanity itself. At its core, this is a story about pain and how we respond to it. Lamia suffers the ultimate loss, the murder of her children. Her response, becoming a monster who inflicts that same pain on others, is deeply human in its twisted logic. We see this pattern in reality, not in mythological form, but in psychological form. People who are abused often become abusers. Communities that suffer violence often perpetuate violence. Trauma, when unprocessed and unhealed, radiates outward, creating new victims who carry forward the cycle. Lamia's story is an ancient recognition of this terrible human tendency. But the myth also asks us to consider responsibility and agency. Is Lamia responsible for her actions? She was transformed by Hera's curse. She suffers from grief-induced madness. She cannot escape her compulsions. Yet she still chooses victims, still perpetuates suffering. Where does victimhood end and perpetration begin? The myth doesn't give us an easy answer. This ambiguity is perhaps the myth's greatest strength. It refuses to let us comfortably categorize Lamia as purely a victim or purely monster. She's both, simultaneously. And that complexity forces us to think more carefully about real-world situations where people who have been harmed go on to harm others. It's easy to condemn or excuse. It's harder to hold both truths at once. That someone can be both victim and perpetrator, that their pain is real and their actions are still wrong. The myth also teaches us about the limits of sympathy. We can understand how Lamia became what she is. We can feel compassion for her loss. But that doesn't mean we can allow her to continue killing children. Sympathy doesn't require us to accept harm. We can recognize someone's pain while still protecting potential victims from them. This is a crucial ethical distinction that the myth navigates quite well. There's also a lesson about the nature of grief itself. The myth shows us that grief, if it becomes all-consuming, can destroy not just the grieving person, but everyone around them. Lamia's inability to move beyond her loss, to find any path forward except revenge and destruction, is a warning. Grief is natural and necessary, but grief that never heals becomes pathological, becomes dangerous. The myth suggests the importance of support, processing, and eventual acceptance in healthy grieving. Lamia has none of these things. She's alone with her pain, cursed to never forget, never rest, never heal. In that isolation, she becomes monstrous. It's a reminder that how we treat people in their grief matters enormously. Isolation intensifies suffering. Community can make the difference between grieving and being destroyed by grief. The seduction aspect of the myth offers its own lessons about how trauma affects relationships and sexuality. Lamia's predatory sexuality is a distortion of a healthy connection. She uses intimacy as a weapon, turns vulnerability into danger. This is tragically realistic to how trauma can damage our ability to connect authentically with others. When you've been deeply hurt, particularly in ways that involve your body or your relationships, it becomes difficult to trust, to be vulnerable, to connect without defensiveness or aggression. The myth also speaks to the power and danger of beauty. Lamia's beauty is her weapon, the trap that lures victims. This reflects ancient anxiety about attractive people being able to manipulate and deceive. But it also suggests something true, that charisma and attractiveness can be used for good or ill, can mask harmful intentions, can make us drop our guard. The myth warns us to look beyond surface appearance, to be cautious about trusting too quickly based on external attributes. And finally, the myth is about transformation, about how we become who we are. Lamia wasn't born a monster. She was made into one through suffering and curse. This raises profound questions about identity and change. Are we defined by what we once were? By what we've become? By our actions? By our circumstances? If trauma changes us fundamentally, are we still the same person we were before? These are not just philosophical abstractions. These are questions people who've experienced severe trauma grapple with constantly. I'm not the person I used to be. The trauma changed me. Am I still me? Lamia's transformation into a literal monster is a mythological representation of that psychological reality. And the myth's answer seems to be that yes, transformation can be so profound that you become something different. But traces of who you were remain, like Lamia's ability to appear as a beautiful woman, like her grief for her lost children that never fades. As we conclude, I want to emphasize something crucial. The Lamia myth has survived for over 3,000 years not because of historical accuracy or even moral clarity. It has survived because it touches something deep in the human experience. It gives form to fears we all share: the fear of losing children, the fear of seduction and betrayal, the fear of beauty that masks danger, the fear of pain so great it destroys your humanity. These fears are not Greek. They're not ancient. They're human, timeless, universal. And that's why Lamia continues to appear in new forms in every generation. She's in our horror movies, our fantasy novels, our video games. She's the beautiful stranger who turns out to be dangerous. She's the grief that becomes murderous. She's the trauma that transforms identity. She's still with us because the human experiences she represents are still with us. But I also want to leave you with a thought about interpretation and meaning. Every retelling of the Lamia myth emphasizes different elements, finds different meanings. Some versions focus on her victimhood, making her sympathetic. Others emphasize her monstrosity, making her purely evil. Some see her as a feminist icon of resistance. Others see her as a cautionary tale about the danger of women's anger. And all of these interpretations have some validity, because myths are rich enough to support multiple readings. What you take away from the Lamia myth says as much about you as it does about the myth itself. If you see her primarily as a victim, that reflects your concern with justice and compassion. If you see her primarily as a monster, that reflects your concern with protecting the innocent. If you see her as a complex figure who is both victim and monster, that reflects your comfort with ambiguity and contradiction. There's no single correct interpretation of Lamia. There's your interpretation, shaped by your experiences, your values, your fears, and your hopes. And that's the beauty of mythology. It's not a fixed text that means one thing for all time. It's a conversation between past and present, between the story and the listener, between universal human experiences and individual perspective. So when you think about Lamia, when you encounter her in whatever form, whether it's reading ancient Greek texts or playing a video game or watching a horror film, ask yourself, what does this figure mean to me? What fears does she embody for me? What questions does she raise that I need to grapple with? How does her story connect to my own experiences of loss, fear, desire, and transformation? The Lamia myth is not just a story about a demon from ancient Greece. It's a mirror that reflects our deepest concerns about humanity, morality, suffering, and identity. It's a tool for thinking through difficult questions that have no easy answers. And it's a reminder that the boundaries between victim and perpetrator, between human and monster, between beauty and horror, are sometimes far thinner than we'd like to believe. The shadows in your bedroom, the fears that wake you in the night, the grief that threatens to overwhelm you, the beauty that seems too good to be true. Lamia has been there for 3,000 years, giving form to all of it. She's been feared, pitted, condemned, celebrated, analyzed, and reimagined countless times. And she'll continue to be, as long as humans tell stories to make sense of their fears and their pain. So the next time you're lying in bed in the darkness, and you hear a sound you can't quite identify, and your heart races with primal fear, remember that your ancient ancestors felt that same fear. And they created Lamia to give that fear a name, a shape, a story. They couldn't make the fear go away, but they could make it comprehensible. They could make it something that could be talked about, protected against, and understood. That's the power of myth. Not to eliminate fear or pain, but to give us tools for confronting them. Lamia is one of those tools, forged in the fires of ancient imagination, tested across millennia, still sharp enough to cut through to the truth of human experience. And that truth is this: we are all vulnerable. We all suffer. We all fear loss. And how we respond to that suffering, whether we become bitter and destructive like Lamia, or whether we find ways to heal and grow, that's the fundamental challenge of human existence. The myth doesn't tell us which path to choose. It only shows us, in the starkest possible terms, what happens when we choose destruction. So choose wisely. Choose compassion. Choose healing. Choose connection over isolation, hope over despair, love over vengeance. Because the alternative is to become Lamia, to become a monster defined entirely by your pain, to become someone who spreads suffering because that's all you know anymore. And 3,000 years of mythology are screaming at us to avoid that fate. Thank you for joining me on this deep exploration of one of mythology's most complex and enduring figures. If you found this video valuable, if it made you think differently about ancient myths or about human nature itself, please consider subscribing to this channel. Hit that like button to help others discover this content, and share your thoughts in the comments. How do you interpret the Lamia myth? What aspects resonated most with you? What questions does it raise that you're still thinking about? Remember, mythology isn't dead history. It's living wisdom, constantly being reinterpreted for new times and new challenges. By engaging with these ancient stories, we connect with thousands of years of human thought and experience. We become part of a conversation that stretches back to the very beginning of civilization. And that's something truly special. Until next time, stay curious, keep questioning, and never stop exploring the depths of human imagination. Because in those depths, in stories like Lamia's, we find not just entertainment, but truth, wisdom that has survived millennia because it speaks to something eternal in the human condition. Thank you for watching.